Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 103. In a recent lecture, we learned about the impact of World War II here at home on the economy, society, the lives of minorities. In this lecture, complementing that previous lecture, we'll talk about the war itself and how America goes from isolationism to becoming involved in World War II, and how the involvement of the United States in World War II will change American foreign relations once again and usher in some key developments that we'll be talking about in lectures to come later in the semester. So here in this lecture, we turn our attention to the war itself and the ways in which it will change American foreign policy in the 20th century. In the 1930s, Japan, still determined to be a major global power, was continuing in those efforts, building up a large military, continuing in its economic transition towards industrialization. As we talked about in our lecture on World War I, Japan was this rising power that had rapidly industrialized, it had militarized, and it was determined to be a great hegemon now in Asia, to eclipse its old rival, China. And so, in the 1930s, in that effort, Japan began to attack its neighbors throughout Asia. In the early 30s, it attacked a portion of northern China. In Manchuria, set up a puppet government known as Manchukuo. But in 1937, it launched a full-scale invasion of China. And so Japan wanted to be now the great hegemon in Asia. It had always been sort of second to the great power in this region, China. And now it was ready to demonstrate it was more powerful than China. And so in 1937, it launches an invasion of China. And this really sets in motion the Pacific theater, the Asian theater of World War II. As I talked about in our lecture on World War II, on the home front, World War II would be fought in 3 different theaters. And the first of which, first part of the globe to erupt into World War II, was here in Asia, where Japan invaded China in 1937. In Europe, also, the war is beginning in the 1930s when Hitler comes to power and openly violates the Versailles Treaty, the treaty that ended World War I. In our lecture on World War I, we learned that the Versailles Treaty was an effort by France and Great Britain to punish crippled Germany. It involved Germany paying massive reparations to Great Britain and France. It involved a massive loss of territory, where Germany lost a huge amount of land, and they also had to radically downscale their military, their army and navy. Well, that led to despair, economic collapse in Germany in the 1920s, and into that came Adolf Hitler, who promised to restore the glory of the German nation. He comes in 1933 and openly violates the Versailles Treaty by putting Germans back to work, building up planes, tanks, and jeeps that he will soon unleash in an effort to attack nations throughout Europe. In 1936, he invaded and annexed the Rhineland, one of the territories that had been taken from Germany at the end of World War I, claiming that that's part of Germany, that the people there speak German, and so that it should be part of Germany. And the other European powers, hoping to avoid another disastrous war, concede to this and allow Hitler to annex the Rhineland. But by the late 30s, he's now attacking and seizing parts of Europe that were never part of Germany, where the people aren't ethnically German or speak German. He invades Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Now, as we learned again in our lecture on World War I, all of those new nations created after World War I were imagined as ways to stop another war. They were efforts to grant to the people of Central Eastern Europe nationalism, a nation of their own. But the point I made in that lecture was that, well, when Hitler comes to power, he wants to regain that land that was taken from Germany, and these become literally the first theaters of the war in Europe. So rather than prevent a war, they actually became the very territory, terrain where World War II would be fought. While all of this is happening around the globe in the 1930s, the United States remains committed to isolationism. So, in a recent lecture on World War I, in one of the questions we had on the exam, We noted that at the end of World War I, Americans would embrace isolationism. That after 2 decades of marching around the globe fighting wars, taking colonies, beginning with the Spanish-American War and U.S.-Philippine War, after World War I, America would embrace isolationism, this idea that we don't need to worry about concerns around the globe, that we've got two big bitchin' oceans to protect us, that the problems of the world aren't our problems. Isolationism. And that prevailed in the 1920s because Americans were, as we talked about in the lecture on the 1920s, searching for meaning, looking inward. And then it continued, it deepened, it amplified in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, Americans were facing this great economic disaster, and there was very little enthusiasm or support for marching around the globe, fighting wars of aggression, taking colonies. And so isolationism deepened in the 1930s amidst the Great Depression. And so while the world is going to war, while Japan is invading China, while Hitler has come to power, Americans remain committed to isolationism. In 1937, a public opinion poll taken in this country by the Gallup Corporation revealed that 94% of Americans supported isolationism as a foreign policy. Now, 1937, as we learned in the previous slide, is the year that Japan invades China. So by all intents and purposes, World War II has begun in 1937. In that same year, 94% of Americans supported isolationism. You can't get 94% of Americans to agree on anything. We're such an argumentative, captious lot, right? You know, something as obvious as the sky is blue. There's enough assholes to come along and say it's green just to be American, right? Just to be different, just to be argumentative. And yet, in 1937, 94% of Americans continue to support isolationism. So what had begun in the aftermath of World War I, driven by war fatigue, questioning of the efficacy of war, 1930s had become the dominant opinion of Americans, even as the world was going to war. By 1940, Hitler had successfully attacked most of Europe, and the only country in Europe that was still outside his dominion and occupation, Great Britain. And that's simply an accident of geography. Hitler had this strategy known as Blitzkrieg. That was the name for it. Translates from the German as lightning war, Blitzkrieg, where you quickly rush your troops on trains to the front, overwhelm your opponent, and force them into surrender. By 1940, France fell, and there are Nazi boots marching through the streets of Paris. Blitzkrieg was very effective on the continent of Europe, but it was not effective against Great Britain because of that accident of geography. Great Britain is an island nation, and you can't rush troops on trains across the English Channel. So 1940, most of Europe is under Nazi control. The one exception, Great Britain. In order to seize Great Britain, Hitler has to attack by sea or air, and this would lead to key battles in World War II, like the Battle of Britain, where the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was facing off against the Royal Air Force, the Air Force of Great Britain, as Hitler attempted to bomb and seize Great Britain by air and sea. The British were very adroit and skilled at stopping that, and ultimately Nazi boots would never march through the streets of London. But this meant that the only country really still able to prevent Nazi occupation was Great Britain. In the face of this, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, gave a speech where he called upon, quote, the New World. He doesn't say the United States explicitly. That's very clear what he meant by the New World. Must now respond. That America must finally shake off the slumber of isolationism and intervene to save Europe, because Europe is about to fall under Nazi control. Now, in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt is running for a third term. As I mentioned earlier in our lecture on the New Deal, Roosevelt's elected in 32 in a landslide, and ultimately he will be re-elected 3 times, in 36, 40, and 44. This is before we amended the Constitution, as we have today, where presidents can only serve 2 terms. Roosevelt always argued steady leadership is vital in this time of crisis, first the Great Depression and later World War II. So in 1940, he was attempting to do something that no American president had ever attempted to prior, run for a third term. And so 1940 had an election year, and Roosevelt is running for re-election. And 94% of Americans want to stay out of the war. So he had a very difficult moment here to parse, a very difficult moment to deal with, where he realized that if elected to a third term, his third term will be dedicated to confronting Germany and Japan. It won't be dedicated to the New Deal, that this was a crisis that America must eventually respond to. But he can't be explicit about that, because if he ran in 1940 saying, elect me or re-elect me, and I'll bring us into World War II, the American people would have rejected that because isolationism remains so strong. In 1940, there was a group headed by Charles Lindbergh, a famed American aviator, called America First. Where have we heard that more recently? Which was the leading isolationist advocacy group in America. Lindbergh was very fond of Adolf Hitler. He said many praising, fulsome things about Hitler, as they both shared a rabid anti-Semitism. Charles Lindbergh was one of the greatest anti-Semites we've ever had in this country. He's best known as an aviator, but in the 30s he entered politics and he formed this group, America First. So here's Charles Lindbergh going around the country telling Americans, don't worry about Hitler, he's no threat to us, America first. If you're watching the show on HBO called The Plot Against America, or if you're familiar with the book, that novel, Philip Roth's novel, Plot Against America, now turned into an HBO series, is about what if historical counterfactual, what if Charles Lindbergh ran for president in 1940 and defeated Roosevelt? How would all of human history look very different? In 1940, Lindbergh was in public challenging Roosevelt, flirting with the idea of running for president with this idea of isolationism, America first. So Roosevelt has to walk this tightrope. He has to realize that if elected to a third term, it's going to be dedicated to World War II, not the New Deal, not the Great Depression. But he can never acknowledge that in public because the American people don't want to be involved in World War II, even in 1940, when it's very clear that Hitler is a threat. And so Roosevelt is in this very difficult position in 1940. He begins a series of very slow movements towards urging the American people to become involved in World War II. He says we're going to be the arsenal of democracy, meaning we're going to respond to this threat, not by entering the war, not by mobilizing forces. Again, that's not a very popular opinion before Pearl Harbor, but by making an arsenal, planes, tanks, and jeeps that can help the nations being attacked by Germany and Japan, China, Great Britain. So this is the first step of urging America to see a responsibility to the nations around the world and slowly nudge America towards a more interventionist role by creating an arsenal. We're going to build things that are going to help these people. But note the phrase here. It's an arsenal of democracy. And that's very telling because what FDR is saying here is that what we're going to help secure and protect is a common value, democracy. That what's at stake here is something larger, values, American values. So this phrase, the great arsenal of democracy, demonstrates how FDR is trying to parse this moment, where he's trying to gently urge Americans towards some sort of role in response to this crisis, and doing so in the name of collective values, where what we're fighting for is something beyond just the interest of Great Britain and China. It's for democracy itself. FDR is reelected in 1940, being the very first and only president to be elected to a third term. And with that now security that came with his reelection, the fact that he would now have 4 more years, he continued his efforts in a more aggressive way towards urging America to respond to the threats of Germany and Japan and shake off the slumber of isolationism. In 1941, Congress passes and Roosevelt signs into law the Lend-Lease Act that allocated billions of dollars at the discretion of the president to be used to help any nation deemed in America's interests. So the Lend-Lease Act is a key moment because it really serves to end isolationism in the sense that now the United States is choosing sides and putting our resources, in this case financial resources, behind those sides. We would spend billions of dollars to help the nations that were being attacked by Germany and Japan. The bulk of the Lend-Lease aid went to Great Britain, again the only nation in Europe that wasn't under fascist control. And there was a sense of kinship, connection with Great Britain, even though they had been our rivals and enemies for most of American history. A common language, a common political tradition, ethnic ties urge us to side with Great Britain. Lend-Lease aid also went to China in their effort to roll back the invasion that began in 1937 of Japan. And, interestingly, a great deal of Lend-Lease aid also went to the Soviet Union. Now, in World War I, a revolution takes place in Russia that leads to the formation of the very first communist government in human history, the Soviet Union. It's the Russian Revolution, the Tsar is killed, Lenin and the Bolsheviks take control and create the Soviet Union out of Russia. They create this brand new government in Russia with a communist government. And ever since then, the United States had come to rival the Soviet Union, seeing communism as a threat to capitalism, the American economic system. But in World War II, we sided with the Soviet Union. We sided with the communists because they too had been invaded by Germany. Hitler invades the Soviet Union, imagining that he could launch his blitzkrieg effort and successfully control the Soviet Union. Many have tried to invade Russia throughout history, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and Adolf Hitler. And they all have failed because Adolf Hitler would not be successful in invading and occupying Russia. Eventually the Russians absorbed that attack, pushed the Germans into retreat. But he was ambitious, like those other fools earlier, Napoleon and Genghis Khan, and attempted to invade the Soviet Union. And because of that, we would help them as well. We would even help the communist government of the Soviet Union, our avowed enemy, because they too had been attacked by Germany. So this was now the government of the United States spending billions of dollars to help China after being invaded by Japan, Great Britain, even the Soviet Union. And therefore, America was no longer isolated. We were spending billions of dollars to aid nations that we deemed in America's interests. But as landmark and consequential as the Lend-Lease Act is, as it can be seen as really the end of isolationism, it doesn't mean we're going to be involved in the conflict militarily. Not one American troop is mobilized. There isn't mass conscription or volunteering among the American population. This is an economic effort, a diplomatic effort. This is not in any way a military response. At this point, America is only involved financially and diplomatically, but it does mark the end of isolationism. Also, in 1941, FDR would attempt to take action against Japan and its efforts to control Asia by cutting off oil sales to Japan. Now, Japan has many, many natural resources, chief among them its population, which is highly educated and has played a key role in Japan's prominence over the last 200 years. But there's one natural resource that Japan has none of: oil. Japan imports 100% of its oil. There is no oil to be found on any of those islands that make up the nation of Japan. As a result, Japan is very dependent on foreign oil. It needs oil in World War II to fuel its planes and tanks. And most of the oil that Japan used came from the United States because in the 1940s, the United States was the largest exporter of oil. We were pumping oil out of Long Beach and sending it to Japan. So FDR takes action to cripple the Japanese war machine by depriving it of this very vital, necessary source of oil. And so we have this action too in 1941. That again isn't military action, it isn't mobilization, but it's a confrontational effort, in this case, to stop Japan's efforts in Asia. But the event that brings America fully into the war, beyond just the Lend-Lease aid, of course, is an attack on American soil at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, in Honolulu, where the American Pacific Fleet was located. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks that Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Now, we know, thanks to the benefit of hindsight, that this is the event that will end isolationism and discredit isolationism and lead to mass mobilization and the ethos of sacrifice and service. We're all in this together. We know that the net result of Pearl Harbor is to rally the American people in an effort now against Japan. We were attacked. Thousands of Americans were killed. This is an attack on American soil, the first attack since the War of 1812, when the British invaded the United States and burned down the White House. I think it's fair to say that in 1941, no one remembered the War of 1812, so this was in the imagination of Americans unprecedented, that our nation would be directly attacked in this way. So it rallies the American people. But at the time, Japan hoped that if it attacked America, took out our Pacific Fleet, it would instead urge Americans back into isolationism. Japan was making a gamble here. They were saying, if we hit America hard, punch them in the nose, show them what war is like, they'll back down. Now, we know that's not what happens. It's the opposite, that when we're attacked, it rallies the American people. But at the time, Japan thought this was a worthy gamble because America had embraced isolationism for decades. America had said, we don't want any confrontations. We don't want war. And so the idea of hitting them hard, showing them what war meant, destroying a huge amount of our Navy, at the time seemed like a smart move. But of course, it has the opposite effect. It rallies Americans. December 8th, people are at the recruiting depot ready to volunteer to serve in the war. It ends isolationism, and it also discredits isolationist ways of thinking. Now this idea that we have two big bitchin' oceans to protect us seems foolhardy. Now it seems like we were sleeping while the world was going to war. Now American blood had been shed. Americans were killed. We were vulnerable. The homeland had been pierced. So this whole idea of isolationism, the America First arguments of Charles Lindbergh, were thoroughly discredited. And we'll talk in lectures later about how after World War II, the Republican Party, the party of isolationism, FDR is a Democrat. He's the president who, as we've talked in this lecture, is trying to urge Americans towards becoming involved. It's his opposition party, the Republican Party, that was the party of isolationism, and we'll see how after World War II, the Republican Party will try to distance itself from that past and recalibrate and recraft its party as a more interventionist power. So Pearl Harbor really demonstrated the folly of isolationism, how you couldn't just wish the problems of the world away, that even if you had a big ocean to protect you, you're still vulnerable in this way. 2,000 Americans were killed in a matter of hours. So though Pearl Harbor seemed like a calculated gamble by Japan that might convince America to back off, reopen oil sales, and allow Japan to continue its efforts in Asia, it had the opposite effect. After the attack, FDR went on the radio to give an address. Now, we talked earlier about his fireside chats, how he was very skilled at using the radio as a way to communicate directly to the American people. It's 1941. There's no television, certainly no internet. Radio was the way of reaching Americans. And he was about to go on the air with a speech that he had written. And just before he went on the air, he changed the speech, but did so in a profound way. The line that he was going to give was that this is a day that will live in history. Well, that's pretty obvious. That's pretty banal. That's a rather clear observation. But just before he was about to go on the air with that statement, he pulled out a pencil, crossed off in history, and wrote instead in infamy. You could see this. It's in the National Archives, the copy of Roosevelt's speech where he makes this ad lib, this change. And in doing so, he was elevating this to a war against evil. A day that will live in history, again, is pretty banal and obvious. A day that will live in infamy was a way of saying what Japan did was evil, and that was part of elevating this to a crusade. Soon after, Congress declares war on Japan, the next day after Pearl Harbor. And it's important to note that on December 8th, 1941, Congress declares war on Japan and Japan only, because Japan was the nation that attacked us. However, Germany had a secret treaty with Japan, which said that if the United States declares war on you, Japan, we, Germany, will come to your aid. And for whatever reason, rattling around in the addled mind of that failed art student with one testicle and a short mustache, Adolf Hitler, he decided to honor this agreement. Now, Hitler wasn't exactly a guy who honored his agreements. He had previously agreed with the Soviet Union to not attack the Soviet Union, a non-aggression pact. And as we talked about on a previous slide here, he did invade the Soviet Union. So Hitler isn't exactly the type of guy to keep his word, but for whatever reason, he decided to honor this agreement. And Germany on December 11th declared war on the United States. Now, soon after we go, oh yeah, well, we declare war against you too. On December 12th, Congress authorized war against Germany. So we went neener, oh well, we declare war on you too. But the whole reason we did that was because a day prior, Germany had declared war on us. Now, if Germany doesn't do that, if Germany doesn't honor its agreement with Japan, maybe we never enter World War II in Europe. Maybe we don't land troops on Normandy Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Maybe we would only be at war with Japan. So here's a good example of how in history sometimes contingency, random events, have such consequence. If it wasn't for Germany declaring war on the United States, maybe we never declared war on Germany. And maybe we would have never been involved in the European side of the war, which will have such key consequences as we'll talk about in lectures soon regarding the post-World War II period. So Germany declares war on us. We turn around and declare war on Germany, which, by the way, the declaration of war on December 12th, 1941 against Germany is the last time in American history that Congress has declared war. And because of that, we haven't had any more wars in American history since World War II. Well, of course we had the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Right now, as we speak, we have these interminable wars in Iraq and Afghanistan you're living through, the longest war in American history, as the war in Afghanistan has long eclipsed the war in Vietnam as the longest war in our history. And so we know, of course, there have been many wars since World War II, but all of them have been undeclared wars. And that speaks to a key fact of post-World War II American history, how after World War II, the president has greater power to send in the troops and start war without Congress. Congress has not declared war since World War II, and yet we've had the Korean War, the American War in Vietnam, many, many wars. And that speaks to what many describe as the imperial presidency, how the president has become much stronger and more powerful since World War II and can start wars on his own without Congress. I mentioned this in our lecture on World War II on the home front, in the way in which it's causal, important in the story of civil rights. But here I want to engage with it directly because it's such a key part of not just the history of World War II, but the history of the United States in the 20th century. In January of 1941, after winning re-election in November of 1940, FDR gave a State of the Union address, looking forward to 4 more years that he realized would be mostly dedicated to World War II. And note the date, it's January 1941. We are almost a complete year, 11 months before Pearl Harbor. In January of 1941, most Americans still supported isolationism. But FDR, with now a 3rd term, realized that he had to rally the American people towards supporting what will later be efforts like the Lend-Lease Act. And to that end, to that goal of trying to urge Americans to finally shed isolationism and embrace a more interventionist role, he gave his 4 Freedoms speech. Now, this becomes a huge, important part of American history. And as we said already, inspiring civil rights. There's a park and monument to the 4 Freedoms speech and the 4 Freedoms concept, both in Washington, D.C. and New York City. It's today still celebrated, this idea of 4 Freedoms and the 4 Freedoms speech as a key part of American history. In the speech, FDR argues we have a chance right now, in January of 1941, well before Pearl Harbor, to again shed isolationism, embrace a more interventionist role, and fight for 4 freedoms that he argued that all human beings should be guaranteed. So this was a very transcendent, Lockean notion of the human condition. All human beings should be guaranteed freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Those are the 4 freedoms. And the idea here is that all human beings should be guaranteed these. Well, of course, for millions of people around the globe in January 1941, they were denied these because their nations had been attacked by Germany and Japan. And so FDR said we got to fight so that these values should prevail. Now notice the first two, freedom of speech and freedom of worship, come right out of the First Amendment. They come right out of the Bill of Rights, and the very first of the 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights, with freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And that's key too, because as we'll talk about in lectures to come, after World War II, America in the Cold War and through today in the 21st century is very much dedicated to this idea that our way is a global way, that our notion of freedom is a global notion of freedom. We've stressed in this class that American history is an argument without end, that the common denominator, the common element of American history is debate. And one of the key sources of debate, one of the key arguments in the argument without end is this question of what is freedom. Well, in the post-World War II period that we're about to examine through today, the United States has this idea that our notion of freedom, established in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, is a global notion of freedom. Everyone should have freedom of speech. Everyone should have freedom of worship. So the first two of the four freedoms come right out of the First Amendment. Now, 1941 happened to be the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. So there's a lot of celebration, acknowledgement of the Bill of Rights in 1941 because it was the 150th anniversary. And we Americans only pay attention to history, only pay attention to anniversaries that end in a zero. If it's the 149th anniversary, no one gives a shit. But if it's the 150th, everyone pays attention. So it happened to be in 1941, a moment when Americans were thinking about things like the First Amendment. And the first of the four freedoms come right out of the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And with it here, we were saying that those American notions of freedom are global notions of freedom. Then you have freedom from fear, the idea that no human being should fear for their lives. And this was very potent and powerful in 1941 because so much of the world had been attacked and invaded by Japan, Germany, and its allies. Then there's freedom from want. And as I said in the lecture on World War II on the home front, this doesn't mean want in the sense of wanting something, desiring something, ooh, the new iPhone. This means want in the sense of deprivation, going wanting. And what FDR was saying here is no human being should be deprived of basic needs. Now that fits with the FDR you've learned about in previous lectures of the New Deal, right? Who had this idea that freedom comes from economic security. He comes in, creates the WPA, the CCC, Social Security. This idea that no one should go without, a safety net of sorts. So that jives with what you've already learned about FDR. But here he was saying that again is a freedom that all human beings should be guaranteed. Freedom from want. Now, couple of consequences here, one of which we've already addressed, and we reiterate. This had huge meanings and implications within the United States for racial minorities who said, we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of worship, we don't have freedom from want, we don't have freedom from fear. I mean, this is a period, as we've learned about in previous lectures, where you have race riots, lynchings, discrimination, where African Americans are being denied many of the relief programs that are designed to provide a minimum economic security to human beings. So one consequence of the Four Freedom speech was how it really offered a good, potent argument to racial minorities in the cause of civil rights. But another key aspect of the Four Freedoms was a way of trying to, again, establish an interventionist role as one in the cause of American values. We're going to be an arsenal for democracy. We're going to fight for freedom. And that notion of freedom is one that is an American vision for the world, all human beings. The Four Freedoms were literally sold to the American people, not just sold in terms of rhetoric and argument. The acclaimed American painter, Norman Rockwell, a very famous painter of the early 20th century, who painted so many iconic covers for a popular magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, was tasked with producing four paintings, all of which corresponded to the Four Freedoms. And then those posters were sold during World War II as a way of generating revenue, like war bonds for the war effort. The image of freedom of speech was a man standing at a town hall giving his opinion. The image of freedom of worship was a man quiet contemplating God in a church. The image of freedom from fear painted by Rockwell was this image of a mother and father tucking their children into bed at night, confident that their children were safe. And the image of freedom from want is one I guarantee you've seen. You probably don't recognize it as, hey, that's what Norman Rockwell painted in World War II. You've probably seen it in different contexts. It is ubiquitous in America every Thanksgiving. It's an image of grandma putting a big old turkey on the table. So later this year, in Thanksgiving time, when you're watching TV and you see this little interstitial, Channel 7 wishes you a happy Thanksgiving, or some other commercial or something, I guarantee you'll see this image. It's so ubiquitous, and it represents freedom from want, bounty. What we often think of as Thanksgiving, a big meal where everyone has what they want. So the four freedoms were sold through these paintings made by Norman Rockwell. And also they were sold to the American people in a series of essays that were written for publications like Time and Life magazine. And so an American writer, pictured here in this slide, Carlos Bulosan, was hired to write the essay that would help explain the most ambiguous of the four freedoms, freedom from want. Again, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those are pretty easy to understand. They come right out of the First Amendment. They come out of American traditions. Freedom from fear, also pretty obvious, right? No one should fear for their life. No one should fear that their country will be bombed or invaded. But what does it mean to be free from want? Well, Bulosan was hired to write an essay that would explain this. And he writes in this essay in a way that would really connect with Americans who had gone wanting, who had been deprived. In 1941, when the Four Freedoms idea circulated through America, Americans had just lived through the Great Depression. They had stood in breadlines. They had lived in Hoovervilles. Bulosan writes in this essay, published in Life magazine, that we will only become a nation free of want when all Americans have prosperity opportunity. When people like him, Carlos Bulosan was born in the Philippines, Filipino. He lived through the American invasion of the Philippines and the U.S.-Philippine War, which we talked about in a previous lecture, the colonization. He was taught English by an American teacher who went to the Philippines as part of that notion of benevolent assimilation, that we're there to teach Filipinos English and how to be civilized. Then he came to the United States. In the 20s, he lived through race riots that took place here in California, like the Watsonville riots, which erupted in 1929 and lasted into early 1930, where Filipinos were beaten and attacked by white mobs here in California. He lived through the Great Depression and lived this very desperate existence, hand-to-mouth, starvation, that he documented later in a book called America's in the Heart, one of the great works of American literature, certainly a celebrated work of Asian American literature. If you ever take a class in Asian American Studies, you'll likely read some or perhaps read the entire book, America's in the Heart. So Bulosan has this remarkable story. He was an immigrant. He was subject to racism and discrimination. And in this essay, Freedom from Want, he writes about people like him, immigrants, racial minorities, people who have long been on the margins, people who have long been excluded from prosperity and opportunity. And he says, America has a chance here to truly be free from want, to extend this virtue of freedom from want to all, and that will only be true once all Americans can enjoy the promise and fruits of the American dream. So Bulosan, a Filipino immigrant, is chosen to write this essay, Freedom from Want. And in doing so, he's challenging America to achieve something that we have not yet achieved. One of the key arguments, and the argument without end that constitutes American history, along with the question of what is freedom, is who are we as a nation? Think back to so many lectures we've had and how we've seen America at various times in its history in confrontation with itself. Who are we? Well, what Bulosan was doing in this essay was saying war can not only reveal who we are, but also who we may become. That if we truly embrace this idea of freedom from want, we can remake America into a place where all are free from want, where everyone, even racial minorities, religious minorities, women, immigrants, have a chance at the American dream. It's a very provocative and interesting argument that demonstrates how Americans were urged to imagine how World War II could not only reveal a certain American character, but be an opportunity to make an American dream possible for so many. So, with Pearl Harbor, America had entered World War II. In early 1945, the end of the war was rapidly approaching, and this was certainly true in Europe. As I mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union is invaded by Germany, Hitler violates that non-aggression pact, and that's why we sent so much aid to the Soviet Union. The Soviet army was able to absorb that attack and then push the German army into retreat. When American troops arrive on Normandy Beach in June of 1944, the D-Day invasion, so vividly detailed in the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan, the movie, the war's already over, because the Soviet army has for some time been forcing the Germans into retreat. The Soviets will famously say, you guys got here at the last moment, try to take all the glory. Where the hell were you in 42, 43, 44, when we were the only land army fighting against the Germans? The Soviets were very good at absorbing that attack, pushing the Germans into retreat. We'll talk more about this in a lecture coming soon on the Cold War. And so when American troops arrive and establish a Western Front in 1944, Hitler's army is already into retreat. And the Allied forces of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union are collapsing on Berlin. Seeing the writing on the wall, Hitler would commit suicide to avoid being captured and prosecuted for his many crimes against humanity during World War II. To avoid capture, he committed suicide, realizing that his Third Reich, which he claimed would last 1,000 years, was about to collapse. So he goes into his bunker with his newlywed bride, Eva Braun, and his German Shepherd, and they commit suicide. Of course, the dog had to be forced to commit suicide. It wasn't his idea. Poor dog, right? Imagine you end up Hitler's dog. That's a bummer, right? You know, you're at the other dogs at the dog park, and hey, who's your owner? Well, I got Hitler, right? You know, poor dog. What do you have to do with the rise of Nazi Germany? But Hitler loved this dog, and he wasn't going to leave the world without him, so he put a cyanide tablet under the dog's tongue, and then soon after, he and his newlywed bride, Eva Braun, committed suicide. The government that inherits the government of Germany after Hitler's suicide would soon surrender, and you have VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, in May of 1945. With Germany now surrendering, the United States would turn its attention to the Pacific in an effort to force Japan into surrender. We employed a strategy in the Pacific known as island hopping, where we went island by island and tried to roll back the occupation and gains made by Japan early in the war. And this was a very, very, very brutal history of warfare. One of the best books about the war in the Pacific by John Dower is titled War Without Mercy. And it's always a good idea when you title a book to have your book title explain the whole idea of your book, War Without Mercy. And in this book, he explains how the war in the Pacific was one without mercy, brutal, violent. You'd have these long battles over one island, and tens of thousands of people would die. But America was successful in this effort, and we retook Guam, the Philippines, and the last islands that had to be attacked and liberated were the Japanese islands. And negotiations began between the United States and Japan. And in late 44, Japan too saw the writing on the wall that they were about to be defeated. One of the many myths that far too many Americans harbor regarding World War II is this idea that Japan refused to surrender. Japan wasn't going to surrender. They're going to fight to the bitter end. They're kamikaze types. It's nonsense. It's bullshit. Very easy to dispute. There are reams of telegrams going back and forth between Tokyo and Washington in this period, where Japan acknowledges we're going to lose. They're just arguing with the United States about how Japan should surrender. And the sticking point was unconditional surrender. The United States demanded unconditional surrender, meaning that Japan surrenders with no conditions. Japan was willing to surrender with just one condition: preserving the life of their emperor. In Japanese culture, the emperor is considered semi-divine, half god, the descendant of the gods that created those islands. Every nation has an origin myth, and there's this origin myth in Japan that the islands were created by these gods, and the emperor is sort of the living descendant of those gods. And that idea was revived in the nationalism of World War II. And so the Japanese feared that their people would be too traumatized if the emperor was executed for his own crimes and various malfeasance during the war. So the sticking point was one condition. Japan wanted to preserve the life of their emperor. The United States said, no, unconditional surrender. In 1945, FDR dies in office, and his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over. Now, Harry Truman, like so many of Roosevelt's vice presidents, was out of the loop. He didn't even know we were working on an atomic bomb. Because Roosevelt would ultimately run 4 times, he didn't want to have a vice president who was too ambitious. He didn't want to have a vice president who wanted to be president. So he kept his vice presidents in the dark, and Harry Truman, who was our last president to only have a high school diploma, he never graduated from college, was so out of the loop that he didn't even know we were working on an atomic bomb. So Roosevelt dies in office. That puts Truman in charge of the war. And in addition to having to preside over the latter stage of the war, he's also told, oh yeah, by the way, President Truman, we've been working on this bomb, and we're really eager to see what it could do. And so because Japan refused unconditional surrender, wanting only one condition, Truman, under the advice of his military advisors who were so eager to use this bomb, dropped an atomic bomb on August 6, 1945 on Hiroshima. And then 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Now, these 2 cities were chosen because they had yet to be heavily bombed during the war. We had bombed Tokyo and various other cities in Japan, but Hiroshima had largely been spared. And though that might have seemed at first good fortune, it would ultimately be its tragic fortune, because we didn't want to drop the atomic bomb on a city that had already been bombed, because then we wouldn't know, was the damage inflicted from the bomb itself or previous bombing raids. So let's pick a pristine target. And we dropped the bomb instead, therefore, on Hiroshima. And when the bomb hit the ground, tens of thousands of people were instantly vaporized, dead, gone. And then in the weeks and months and years that followed, the death toll would rise as people died from radiation poisoning, radiation burns, all sorts of after effects. You were probably better off dying when the bomb hit rather than survive and then die later in the excruciating experience of radiation poisoning. To this day, here we are in the 21st century, and these cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have unusually high cancer rates. In Japan, they have very low cancer rates because they eat what we're supposed to be eating: rice, vegetables, and fish, right? We Americans have high cancer rates because we eat bacon, pastrami, disaster burgers, right? And never exercise. But overall, Japan, very low cancer rates. The exception, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And people, of course, speculate that those high cancer rates are due to the radiation that's still in the environment 70, almost 80 years later. So arguably, we're still killing people through cancer in these cities. World War II ends with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. The first and hopefully last time nuclear warheads have ever been used. The only country to actually use a nuclear weapon, with all the fear and hysteria of Iran and North Korea, the United States. We're the only nation that's actually used them. And this means a new age for humanity had begun. An age where it is possible with a push of a button to vaporize an entire nation and soon an entire world. And that will play a factor in what I said at the very beginning of this lecture, how World War II will change American foreign policy in the 20th century. After World War I, America would retreat into isolationism, and it will take Pearl Harbor to eventually return us to an interventionist role. After World War II, America would recommit to being a dominant global power, an interventionist power. And that will lead to Cold War and what we see today, where America in the 21st century remains this global Goliath. So unlike at the end of World War I, at the end of World War II, America was committed anew all over again to being this interventionist power. And you could see that in a number of ways. After World War II, the United States would eclipse Great Britain as the most powerful nation on earth. From 1763, with the end of the 7 Years' War, through 1945, the most powerful nation on earth wasn't the United States, it was Great Britain. But weakened by 2 world wars, World War I, World War II, Great Britain would decline in power, the United States would eclipse Great Britain, and that's symbolized by the fact that the US dollar after World War II would now be established as the global currency by which all other currencies are measured. Previously, that had been the British pound. So the British pound was replaced by the US dollar. The United States would establish a number of international institutions designed to remake a world that had been destroyed, decimated by 2 world wars. the first half of the 20th century. World Bank, International Monetary Fund. And though they are international in name, they are dominated by American banks. The real money behind the World Bank and the IMF, Chase, JP Morgan, American banks. And so America would play this crucial role after World War II in remaking the world and exerting its financial power around the globe. Here's another good example of how the end of World War II is so different than the end of World War I. How at the end of World War I we had isolationism, at the end of World War II we had interventionism. At the end of World War I, as we learned in a previous lecture, we created the League of Nations, which was this international body, the dream child of Woodrow Wilson. But the United States never joined it because America embraced isolationism. And the League of Nations ultimately failed. After World War II, rather than embrace isolationism, again, America was committed all over again, anew, to being a global dominant power. And that's symbolized by the fact that at the end of World War II, we helped create the United Nations, which would replace the failed League of Nations. And we not only joined it, we headquartered it right here in the United States, in New York City, where its headquarters remains to this day. Now, you hear a lot of people, particularly conservatives, criticize the United Nations as this malevolent force that makes us give up our sovereignty. It's nonsense. We are the most dominant nation in the United Nations. We, United States, control the United Nations. It's mostly done America's bidding around the globe. It's headquartered here in New York City. So rather than be this force for destroying American sovereignty, the United Nations has been mostly a force for America exerting its influence around the globe. The title of the second lecture, examining World War II, is World War II and the American Century. And that title comes from Henry Luce. Henry Luce was the publisher of Time magazine and Life magazine, two very influential periodicals read by most Americans in the mid-20th century. Doodaloo, 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 go back with me to a bygone age where there were these things called magazines, and they were printed on paper. And once a week, a guy would put one in your mailbox and you'd read it. Well, in the 20th century, magazines, before the internet age of today, were the prevailing way a lot of Americans came to understand their nation and its role in the world, and Time and Life were the most influential of these. Henry Luce was the publisher of Time and Life magazine, and in 1943, in the pages of Time magazine, he advanced this idea that the 20th century is the American century, meaning this is the century where the United States emerges as the most powerful, influential nation on earth. It is the source of the title of this lecture because Luce turned out to be 100% correct. Yes, in the 20th century, America does eclipse Great Britain and Germany and France and emerge as the most powerful nation on earth, not just financially and militarily, but culturally, as the world watches Hollywood movies, wears Levi's, and drinks Coca-Cola. Luce turned out to be correct. Now, it took some cheek, some moxie in 1943 to declare the entire century ours when it wasn't even halfway over, but he turned out to be correct. What he was arguing in 1943 during the war, even before the war had ended, was that in the century, a century that 1943 wasn't even halfway over, is ours, meaning we're going to influence the global order. After World War II, America would commit anew to being a global interventionist power, making the 20th century the American century. And part of that is the fact that after World War II, the United States would emerge more powerful and soon locked in a rivalry with the other most powerful nation on earth, second most powerful nation on earth, the other nation to emerge more powerful after World War II, the Soviet Union. And that will lead to the Cold War, which we'll talk about in earnest in detail in lectures to come. A 50-year rivalry after World War II, where the United States and the Soviet Union are locked in this rivalry. And the Cold War rivalry will play out in the shadow of the bomb, in the way in which World War II ended. Cold War was always a high-stakes rivalry because both nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, had the ability with the push of a button to destroy humanity. So much was at stake, the fate of humanity. And so, at the end of World War II, rather than retreat into isolationism, Americans would embrace interventionism. Partly due to the fact that it would be locked in this rivalry with another nation, a communist nation, the Soviet Union, that wanted to also influence the globe, and also because so much was at stake where new technology, nuclear war, made the very fate of humanity hang in the balance. So in this lecture, we've talked about how we go from isolationism to war. Talked about how the war, once again, was this moment for rethinking America, part of that argument without end. Who are we as a nation? And the way World War II ends sets the stage for America resuming its commitment to being a dominant global power, setting the stage for things we'll talk a lot about in lectures to come, like that Cold War rivalry.